Hello, I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent, and a very warm welcome to this fringe meeting on the effect of COVID-19 on child poverty, a Bright Blue event in partnership with the Child Poverty Action Group. Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. Their research focuses on domestic, social, education, environmental and economic policy, and they will have a major relaunch later this autumn. Bright Blue has launched a new magazine for this party conference examining the impact of COVID-19 on our family and social lives. And it includes an interview with the Treasury Minister, Jessie Norman, MP. People can read this online at their website, brightblue.org.uk. Please tweet about this event using hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CPC20. And if you want to go on Twitter to find them, they are at We Are Bright Blue, and also for the Child Poverty Action Group at CPAG UK. Attendees who want to ask questions can do so via the Slido function. So please get your questions in. So the subject today: historically, recessions have tended to reduce relative measures of poverty, not because people get any richer when the economy tanks and unemployment rises, but because the incomes of those in the middle tend to fall faster than the incomes of those at the bottom. But what's happening in this most unusual of recessions, in some ways a deliberate one brought on by public health control measures? And what, the subject of this event, is the impact on child poverty? Benefits were increased in March. Did that end up helping children? What impact did the furlough scheme have? Is it having? What should policymakers be doing to protect children from poverty as we enter the next phase of this crisis? How does it fit in with the levelling up agenda of this government? And remember that relative poverty is only one very specific income-related measure of poverty. There are other ways of measuring deprivation as well. What's happened to families and children's ability to access what we would consider the basics this year? To discuss all of that and more, we have Stephen Crabb MP, who is the chair of the Welsh Affairs Select Committee. He has previously been Secretary of State for Wales and also for Work and Pensions. We have Alison Garnham, who is the Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group. We have Baroness Stroud, Philippa Stroud, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Legatum Institute and a co-founder and former executive director of the think tank, the Centre for Social Justice. And finally, we have Ryan Shorthouse, who is the founder and chief executive of Bright Blue. So what's going to happen is each of our panelists will speak for 5 minutes, and then we will open it up for discussions and your questions. So please, as I said before, use the Slido function to get your questions in. On that note, let's go to our panelists, and let's go to Stephen Crabb to kick us off, please. Over to you, Stephen. Stephen, if you could unmute.
Thank you very much, Ben, and good afternoon, everybody. Really pleased to be on this panel. It was almost exactly a year ago at the Physical Conservative Party conference in Manchester. I was on a panel with Polly Toynbee, where we were talking about in-work poverty, and what had been going on in the labour market and what was happening to family incomes. And the point I made right at the outset at that fringe event was that despite the Conservative Party, my party, having a really strong record to talk about in terms of jobs growth, the 10 years of enormous growth of employment opportunities in the labour market, nevertheless, it was a very difficult issue for us which we needed to address around in-work poverty, an issue that should really trouble us as conservatives, believing as we do in the nobility of work. And here we are 12 months on, and we've had this enormous disruptive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, just underlining again that this is such a serious issue for us to be focusing on. And what have we seen over the last 6 months? There's no struggle at all to find people who will tell you that they've had a very good lockdown. There are a great many families out there for whom the lockdown experience actually meant a boost to their household incomes. The trouble is that there are also a great many families out there for whom the pandemic has been a disaster for their household finances. And that's something that we don't ignore as a Conservative government. And when the Prime Minister and when the Chancellor of the Exchequer talk about the steps they've taken to use that phrase, throw their arms around the country, they genuinely mean it. I think the government genuinely deserves enormous credit for the speed with which it put together the COVID-19 safety net, the scale of that support, most notably through the furlough and the self-employed income support scheme. But also, and you mentioned it, Ben, in your introduction, that decision very early on in the lockdown to increase benefits, increasing universal credit by £20 per week for the standard allowance. And that's been really, really important for families, and important when you bear in mind that as a result of choices we as a government took 4 or 5 years ago to basically squeeze working age benefits. The truth is that the main rate for unemployment in the UK had fallen in real terms to probably the lowest level it's been since the 1990s. So there are very good reasons why, despite even without the pandemic, wanting to increase the benefit. But as I say, it's been really, really important for many families during the course of this pandemic. And it's why I've been making the argument in recent weeks why this temporary increase in benefits, and it was intended to be a temporary 12-month measure, really we shouldn't be thinking about withdrawing that next April. I just think that's unthinkable. The idea that with hundreds of thousands more families struggling with the adjusting to losing their jobs, relying on benefits a pretty hard landing. The idea that we would remove that increase at that time, I just think the government should have a plan for dealing with that and work out what it wants to do and announce that fairly quickly. Otherwise, they're going to be back in the territory of, and we've seen it before, doing a hastily performed U-turn on a welfare issue, and the government doesn't need to do that. So that's my opening argument: the need to retain the increase in benefits as a key measure within the overall safety net.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Look forward to talking later about what perhaps they're thinking in not already making that decision about the £20 a week uplift. But let's go straight on to Alison Garnham. Over to you, Alison.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for that, Stephen. And I completely agree with Stephen that it was quite right for Rishi Sunak to conclude that the £73 a week rate for universal credit was too low, and adding the £20 uplift. And it's allowed us to really celebrate the important role that social security plays, and it's going to be absolutely crucial to our recovery, along with the NHS. And the public seem very supportive of what's been a very radical and popular approach, which, given we're having something like 80% of previous earnings recognised in the job retention scheme, is pretty radical. But COVID-19 has been a big struggle for families with children. We've got evidence of increased costs, running down savings, increased borrowing. We did a study called Learning Under Lockdown with parents and children, 3,000 parents, 1,300 children. A third of them reported having to buy extra devices for their children's learning. 8 out of 10 in our study with the Church of England saw deterioration in living standards due to increased costs and falling incomes. And there's lots of other studies showing very similar things. JRF's work shows very similar findings, with 70% cutting back on essentials, 60% borrowing, and so on. So it's likely to lead to increased debt, and also we find in these studies mental health problems. We're particularly worried about second earners who, due to lack of parental leave and schools running restricted hours after long closures and the loss of extended school activities, we think is causing unemployment to rise, particularly for mothers. And so that, along with rising unemployment for families and young people, is a recipe for more child poverty, in our view. And of course, we didn't go into this in the greatest position because of the cuts since 2010. I mean, this year we would have been spending 36 billion a year less on social security than we were in 2010. So child poverty has risen, the bottom 20% has lost income, and the rise in employment hasn't been a match for the opposing pressure from benefit cuts, to the extent that we've actually seen the numbers going deeper into poverty being greater than the number of children falling into poverty, which is quite a stark finding for this period of time. I think one of the things that's really good, and I'm really glad Stephen mentioned in-work poverty, One of the things I hope we'll finally understand from this pandemic is who many of the British people are claiming benefits like universal credit. They're low-paid workers, the nursing assistants, carers, cleaners, postal workers, retail workers, who we've seen sort of working really hard during the pandemic. We know 72% of poor children live with working parents, and this is what these workers look like. They're generally not very long out of work. They contribute through paying tax. But we need to change the idea that there's a group of people that pays in and another group that takes out, because that's really not the picture in the UK. For the first time, with doubling the number of claimants of universal credit, and a quarter of the new claimants are going to be managerial, administrative and professional people, many in blue wall seats, and they're going to expect the social security system to support them. So I would totally agree with Stephen that the idea of removing the £20 uplift will be a really difficult one to pull off. And as Marcus Rashford has shown, people don't want child poverty to be ignored. So the timing is bad. If it comes off next April, it'll be happening at a time of mounting economic pressure, not a good time to lose £1,000 a year. We reckon it would push a further 350,000 children into poverty. And furthermore, at the same time, the grace period for the benefit cap, so for people who came onto universal credit in March, that time will be up in December, just when family budgets are at the most stretched. So there are all kinds of reasons why removing additional support is not a good idea. We'd like to see a targeted response to families with children. So we've talked about improving child benefit, which has lost 23% of its value since 2010. It plays a really important preventative role. It would be a real recognition of the additional cost of the pandemic. You won't be surprised to know we've got a list of things we'd like to see government do as ever, which includes keeping the £20 increase, increasing child benefits and children's benefits, getting rid of the benefit cap and two-child policy, extending free school meals, and putting more money into local welfare assistance. And of course, not all the solutions to child poverty lie within social security. We're really keen to start having a conversation cross-party about what the long-term responses to child poverty should be. I mean, one of them will be a high-quality work programmes, employment support. We're working with Barclays Bank on a project called Your Work, Your Way to support potential second earners into work and to progress in work in Bury and Coventry and Taunton and Luton. But we would like to see sort of agreement about the need for sort of leadership on child poverty, strengthen social security, decent work, pay and progression, improved childcare, including extended schools, inclusive education, secure homes and decent services to families. So a conversation about intergenerational fairness, we think, is now overdue. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. Alison, be good to get into a sense of what your priorities are. If you could have only a few things on that list, what they would be, but we'll talk about that shortly. But for now, let's go to Baroness Stroud. Philippa Stroud, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben, and great to follow Stephen and Alison as well. Just to put the kind of numbers in context, we're talking about 5.9 million couple families in poverty, about 26%, and about 2.4 million families, and that's 48%. So I just think it's helpful sometimes for us to start visualising just the scale of the challenge that lies ahead of us, and also the fact that whilst numbers have gone up and down at the margins over the last 20 years, by and large, this has actually been a fairly static challenge. And I think it would be safe to say, when I look back over a 20-year period, that actually governments of all colour have been challenged by these numbers. So what do we know about children who are living in poverty? I think the first thing I want to draw attention to is that about 50% of people in poverty actually have a disabled or are disabled or live in a family where someone has a disability, either a child or an adult. And I think we've misunderstood or underestimated just the role disability plays as a driver of poverty, and maybe we can pick some of that up a little bit later. Also, more likely to be in part-time work and not full-time work. So if you are in full-time work, there's a 90% chance you will not be in poverty. But if you are in part-time work, there's about a 50% chance that you will be in poverty and a 70% chance if you are out of work. These things are linked. And just picking up on what Stephen was saying about in-work poverty, a lot of that was driven by people who were unemployed, moving into low hours and not getting enough to get themselves over a poverty line. We also know that the families who are in poverty are more likely to be in persistent poverty. So a situation that hasn't changed, that's gone on year after year after year. So what impact has COVID had on the drivers and consequences of child poverty? The first is a positive impact, as both Stephen, as has been said already by Stephen and Alison. A positive impact, the £20 uplift, and I think people beginning to understand actually what life is like on a very, very low income. And hats off to the DWP for handling 3 million new claimants with a 90% success rate of on time and the right amount. I think, goodness me, that's a huge job. Then second, in terms of drivers, unfortunately, obviously, COVID has impacted vulnerable people more directly than any other group, and particularly those in deep poverty. So 65% of those who were employed prior to COVID-19 and in deep poverty have either lost their job, had their hours reduced, or been furloughed. I think that's something really significant for us to understand, that the place that this has hit the hardest is amongst the most vulnerable. And then secondly, when you think of the child's experience and the fact that work and skills are the best route out of poverty, we know that 2 million children did no work at home at all during that time, and 4 million lost contact with their teacher. And I think this is something very, very serious about the connection between work and between school and home. And then my final point is on the issue of family. We hear lots and lots of negative news about how terrible COVID has been for family life. And obviously we have seen a rise in things like domestic abuse. But also for some families, they did find each other again. And there were some really positive stories that came out of that time. I've been reading a new report that JRF has been doing on destitution. And there's some beautiful stories in that, of people turning back to their families again and finding that there was, in fact, support.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that, Philippa, and thank you for also a very useful job, I think, of describing what the features of these families who are in poverty are. That's a very important thing to understand, to get to grips with, if we're going to address the problem properly. But now let's go to Ryan Shorthouse. Let's hear what you've got to say, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben. And the speakers have looked at the impact of COVID on poverty levels. I want to think about how we might reduce poverty in the long term. And it is indeed the case that relative poverty has been rising for some years and is being worsened as a result of COVID. And I think there's three ways of looking at this. Really trying to improve both a person's financial capital, so their money basically in their pocket. And sometimes Conservatives can be quite sceptical of cash transfers, believing, it's a small amount of money. But for people with very little amount of money, actually every pound really does count. So cash transfers from government do help. The second is around building people's human capital. And there is a strong link, particularly in this country, between educational and employment outcomes. So improving people's education, their basic skills levels throughout their life is a must if we want to help people climb out of poverty. And the third is around building people's social capital, the relationships that they have with family and people around them in their neighborhood. There's now lots of evidence to suggest that people are less likely to be in poverty if they have stronger and more diverse relationships. So how can public policy help people build those strong relationships and diversify their relationships to the types of institutions that we cultivate. So looking at COVID on financial capital, it is true, as Stephen talked about, that there's been a real divergence. So people in higher income deciles have seen actually a bolstering of their finances because they're saving more. But for people in bottom deciles, there's been a worsening. They're going into debt more because they're having to spend, their employment opportunities are reducing. So we're seeing a real divergence as a result of COVID. And of course, people are losing jobs, and that's likely to accelerate in the future. So we need that strong social security system. It's great that the Chancellor has uprated universal credit, so the basic amount is increased by 20 quid. But as the speakers have said, that expires soon, and that needs to be definitely extended without a doubt. And really, this is difficult territory for the centre-right. People on the centre-right sometimes very sceptical of welfare. But in a free society and in a market system where you will have people who suffer misfortune, their relationships will break down, jobs will be lost. That is an inevitable part and downside of an enterprising free society. So if you want to sustain that sort of system, which Conservatives do, then you need a robust welfare system to sustain support for that system and participation in that system. So actually, I don't think a strong safety net is something which is antagonistic to Conservative belief in free markets and free society. I think it's vital to have a strong welfare system to continue that type of system. So what I don't want us to happen is to have the deep and disproportionate cuts that happened in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, where working age benefits were cut very deeply, and that has led to a rise in child poverty, particularly from the middle part of the last decade. And I think, what it's shown, really, the crisis, is that actually often what happens to us in life is not down entirely to our agency and merit. Sometimes things happen out of the blue, i.e. a global pandemic, which is completely not our fault, completely hits us out of the blue, and often we suffer brute luck. And that's what the social security system is there to support people through. And so how do we build a stronger social security system which isn't depleted in the way that it was in the last decade? We're doing a project on this at Bright Blue. And what I'm particularly interested in is some social insurance models which are particularly prevalent in the continent, and looking at the role that employers might play in contributing to people's kind of welfare in the future if hard times hit. So just as we have auto-enrollment for pensions, is there a kind of sidecar account that you can create through auto-enrollment, which employers contribute to, which people might be able to draw down from, not just when they go into retirement, but also when hard times face them? So it's a kind of individualized tax on employers. So instead of employers being taxed it going into the general treasury, maybe that tax goes into their workers' pots, their own kind of financial accounts which they can use for hard times. So I'd like to look at those sorts of things. So it's not just the state, but also employers contributing to people, to individual social security accounts. And then thinking also about the furlough scheme and what next for that. I think it's been internationally and historically a very generous scheme that the Chancellor has given. But I do worry now, as it's phased out from Halloween, that it's quite badly targeted. And there are some sectors, let's take restaurants, theatre, which may not be viable at the moment because of the social distancing rules, but will be in the future. And the level of support that they're expected to give in to now to wages will just not be viable. Whereas actually some sectors will be receiving quite a lot of support, for example, through the jobs bonus scheme, which maybe they don't necessarily need now because demand is picking up again. So, the Chancellor is very sceptical of targeted schemes and believes you just need to get the money out the door. But actually, he has targeted tax cuts, for example, in VAT in particular sectors, bringing it down to 5%. I think he could do that with the furloughing and the job subsidy scheme at the moment. So I think more targeting there is needed as well. I'm conscious of time, so I won't go in on social capital. Maybe I'll come to that in the end. But on human capital, obviously the school closures have been particularly bad on children from lower income backgrounds. And there's been lots of analysis which is to suggest that there's been real learning loss and a widening of the attainment gap during this COVID period when children weren't at school, and children from deprived backgrounds in particular were not getting those exposures to high quality teaching. And that's going to obviously have a lot of long-term profound impact. I do think the government made a mistake not making it a priority and indeed compulsory for children to still be in school during that period. And it is vital, I now think, that schools remain open, even if the number of cases increases. I think that is absolutely essential that schools are the number one priority, that they should stay open. The final thing I'd say about human capital is, just as the government during this COVID crisis is now giving loans to businesses to stay afloat during a difficult time, individuals, I think, require support to make that transition to a new economy that's been created by COVID, but also by automation. And there needs to be budgets, loans, I think, for people to do training. And the government has announced just recently a Bright Blue policy, which is a lifelong loan entitlement, which is equivalent to kind of 4 years of undergraduate training. But that loan entitlement, which will be a pot of money, can be used not just on undergraduate degrees, but any form of training, which is FE, HE, etc. And I think that sort of flexibility is very welcome. The details still need to be done on that. But I think what will be important is that for any point in your life, whether it's workplace training, university or FE-based training, you have a pot of money which the government gives to you, and then you pay that back only on an income contingent basis when you're earning enough in the labour market. If you don't do so, you don't pay anything back. And I think that sort of support is really needed to help people upskill and reskill during a time when the economy really is changing and people need to prepare for the new jobs that are being created. So lots more I can say, particularly about social capital, but maybe we'll come to that in the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ryan. A lot to think about there, but I want to pick up on something you said about your hope that there will not be further cuts to welfare and social benefits when we come out of this crisis. The Prime Minister himself said that we will not be returning to austerity when this is over. But I wonder to what extent that would give people like you and the others on the panel hope that we will not see cuts to benefits as a result of that. Does that political sort of orientation, that pledge, mean that there won't be the kind of cuts we saw in the austerity period over the last decade? And I'm thinking also something you said, Stephen, about what you were saying, like you hope that they increase this £20 increase in benefits. What are the reasons why they haven't done it already? Is that perhaps motivated by a sense in the Treasury that they are concerned about the scale of the bill, about the impact on the public finances of doing it? Perhaps you could give us your thoughts on those two questions, first of all. And if you could unmute, I think you're muted.
Every time. Thank you, Ben. There are people in the Treasury who are really sceptical about putting more money into the benefit system. They will be advising the Chancellor that he can get more bang for his buck by using the money on retraining schemes and around some of the skills agenda that Ryan's just been talking about. The truth is that we need to be doing both. The £20 uplift, and Alison can correct me if my figure is wrong, will cost the Treasury around £5 billion a year in terms of ongoing costs. So we're not talking small sums of money here. The fact that the government has yet to say clearly and definitively it's going to extend that £20 uplift makes me nervous. There was an opportunity in the Chancellor's winter economic statement for him when he was setting out some of the other steps he was taking just to reaffirm our commitment to ensuring that the people on the lowest incomes in our society are protected, and to say that he would extend that measure. And the fact that he hasn't suggests to me there is still a big political row ongoing about this. So it's very useful that we're having this discussion in this conference setting. I just think, when you think of all those new MPs that we brought into Parliament at the last election, this really significant shift amongst low-income voters towards the Conservatives. First time ever that low-income voters supported the Conservatives over the Labour Party. When these people start waking up to the fact that they will be a cliff edge in terms of their family incomes, potentially losing up to £1,000 per year overnight, I think the email inboxes will start to fill up. And MPs, colleagues of mine who've yet to really take an interest in the full detail of welfare policy will start to feel very, very concerned indeed. And I just think politically the government will be into U-turn territory, but we will see. In the meantime, I think there's important arguments to still be made about this.
Yeah, thank you. And Baroness Stroud, can I ask whether you share the hope of Ryan that when we don't see another round of cuts to benefits, is that something that you're pushing for as well, that they shouldn't be any more cheese pairing, as some would put it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that all this £20 does is put universal credit back closer to what it was very originally intended to be. So this isn't like an extraordinary generosity, although we're really grateful for it. It actually just recalibrates the welfare system. So I think that is the first thing. The second thing is, it is much better almost not to give something than to give it and then take it away. And these are people's lives. And, in governments behave as though, you can give £1,000 here and you can take £1,000 away. You really can't do that to people. And people really need stability. And so I'm with Stephen. If we weren't going to make it permanent, we shouldn't have done it in the first place. Now that we've done it, we need to stand by it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we've got some questions coming in. And let's start with one by Stephanie Jones. I'm going to put this one to you, Alison. She says, has the time come to enshrine inflation adjustment for benefit rates into law? I don't think that was on your list, but is that something you would advocate?
Yes, I'm definitely, because one of the biggest cuts that's been made over the last 10 years was the failure to uprate. In fact, that's where the big losses in income took place. And I think, years ago, we used to have benefits index linked to wages, and now it's linked to inflation. So they rise much more slowly. If you like, low-income families are on a slower escalator than people's wages are nowadays. And so there is a strong case to say we should put something in law about how they should be raised. I think, you could even make an argument for having a triple lock on child benefit, for example, as pensioners have had. Families with children have fallen a long way behind. The other point about this that I would like to make is about economic stimulus. I know Stephen has said this before, that taking so much money away from low-income families is kind of bad for local economies. Low-income people spend all their money, they have to. So if you take money off them, it's sort of sucked out of the local economy. We've seen the impact of that. So paying more in social security is not waste. It's also economic stimulus and really important for the recovery.
Now, we've got a couple of questions which I'm going to take together because in a way, they deal with the same theme, which is one of measurement. We've had a question from Richard Smith, and he says, considering the disproportionate effect of the recession on those on lower incomes, is there a case for the welfare system addressing not only poverty, but also income inequality while the economic recovery occurs? Well, of course, the main measure of poverty is an income inequality one in some ways. It's 60% of average wages. So targeting poverty does target inequality in that sense. But this brings us on to the other question, which is from Tom Starry. He says, how can we stop poverty statistics being treated as a political football, with one party saying poverty has gone up and the other one saying it's gone down? Maybe we can go to you, Ryan. I mean, is part of this project about getting a rigorous definition of what poverty is, because that's one of the reasons, isn't it, that you get these sort of claims and counterclaims which don't lead to this rather unedifying squabble without actually focusing on the underlying problem. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I agree that, poverty is something which is, multifaceted. It's not just about lack of money. It's also about social exclusion and lack of opportunities as well. But it definitely includes not having enough money. And the government during the coalition days, I think, was incorrect to remove in law one of the measures of poverty, and Baroness Stroud's organisation, the Social Metrics Commission, has been working very hard to establish a new material relative poverty measure, and I think that is definitely something that should be adopted, because we need to track that and hold government and different parts of government, local government, for example, account on that measure. So I definitely feel that just seeing poverty through the prism of a lack of money is incorrect. But I also think it's incorrect to say that it doesn't matter about lack of money, and it doesn't matter relative to everybody else. There's a big debate sometimes on the centre right whether poverty is about absolute levels or it's relative levels, and I actually do think relative measures matter, relative levels matter. Poverty, if you don't have enough resource to participate in society, and in terms of the kind of average living conditions and average experiences and opportunities that people are having, then you are impoverished, and that is captured through a relative measure.
Yeah, and let me bring in Baroness Stroud there. I mean, there is a lot of concern about inequality, as we've seen lately. Is that separate to the concern about poverty? How do you see those two issues?
I think inequality is really important. Well, equality is really important for the cohesion of society, and for us to move forward as a society, and for us to enable people to fulfil their full potential. And actually, to be honest, one of the shocking statistics in the Social Metrics Commission report is the racial inequality when it comes to poverty. And I think when we look at areas where we should be putting time, energy and effort, this is definitely one. But I just want to pick up on what Ryan was saying about the measurement of poverty, because we have an opportunity to drive consensus on this new measure. Left and right have come together to create this new metric, and what we've seen, that the government is still hesitant, and part of that is they'd really like to be able to measure poverty in absolute terms, because it's a forever dwindling number. But actually, if we really want to address issues of poverty, we need to understand how the whole of society fits together. And the advantage about the Social Metrics Commission is it actually is both. It's a hybrid of relative and absolute. And if we can help the government to understand this, to create a measure that people on both sides can come around and say, we'll back this, we'll develop policy and a strategy connected with this, we could then begin to make real progress.
We've had a question in from Emily Barnard, and she asks, do we have a problem with social security stigma in this country, which may make life especially hard for children? How can we change that as a society? Stephen Crabb, do you want to take that one? Do you think that the pandemic and the experience of a lot more people of receiving benefits and receiving support of some sort will change that stigma that exists?
Yeah, so the person asking the question is exactly right. For a long time, we've had that kind of stigma, and if you're a child or teenager, particularly growing up in a household that relies on benefits, you'll feel that very keenly. I went through that when I was a youngster. It's not just the material differences of things that you don't have that friends or others of your peer group have. It's that sense of you just being different in an almost non-definable way. The same issue could be said of food banks. There's an awful lot of people who will refuse to go to a food bank because even though they might be in a position of real crisis in their lives, just feel that it's something almost shameful for them. And there's a shame around poverty, which we haven't talked about so far. And obviously, governments aren't perhaps the best place to tackle that, but it can be very, very real. I mean, just to kind of feed back into the discussion that Philippa and Ryan were having. I mean, one of my hopes from the whole COVID experience is that we can forge a new political consensus around the welfare state. And that will go some way to, I think, tackling stigma in society around social security. It should be something that Conservatives can speak about with confidence, that we can support politically, and take pride in that. That's what a decent society does. It has a decent safety net. And yes, there will always be arguments around the edges of whether we could do more for this group or that group. But actually just believing in that basic safety net, I think, is something that should mark us out as Conservatives.
Well, let me bring in Alison there on that point. I mean, you campaign on this all the time, and you have done for many years now. Do you sense that there is that consensus that Stephen was talking about the need to tackle child poverty? Do you sense that you are pushing on an open door? It's just about getting the mechanics right. What are your views?
I feel like we are at this event. It's great. Break out of agreement. I think it's been difficult for some time because I think there's been an unwillingness, as Stephen said, to kind of accept what's happening to the child poverty figures in particular, because that's where there's been a big increase. But I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be a big opportunity for more agreement now. There are clearly people here who want to talk about it. There's a lot of agreement about measurement, about the sorts of policies that might be worth talking about. That's really great news for us because, we just need to get people talking about it and agreeing some steps to take.
Now, we've had a question from Andy Hayward, and he says there's a big focus on benefits in debates such as this. How can we better address the root causes of child poverty, such as education, discrimination, low quality jobs, etc.? And Baroness Stroud, you mentioned disability and part-time work in your remarks. Where are you at the moment when you think about the root causes of poverty? What are those the main drivers? Have you got others to add? What do you think? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Yeah, just unmute myself. So absolutely, yes. We, when I was at the Centre for Social Justice, we did a lot of work on issues such as family breakdown, failed education, addiction, debt, and welfare dependency as some of the drivers. And I would say we still need to keep a focus on all of those. But as I've really worked with the poverty data, one of the things that has really, really concerned me is the issue of disability, and particularly the obstacles that it puts in people's way for getting full-time work. And that may be because their child has a disability and therefore they're nervous of leaving them, or there isn't actually the proper skilled childcare to be able to even leave them, or it may be their own sense of not being able to do work full time. But either way, it leaves them not being able to earn the hours, work the hours that they would want to be able to get out of poverty. And I think that this is something we really need to focus on. And this could be a huge area of agreement cross-party if we really developed a work strategy, because we know that 1 million people with disabilities want to be able to work. If we had a proper work strategy for people to support people with disabilities, and a proper childcare strategy to support the children with disabilities as well.
Now, we've had an interesting question from Greg Gunther, and he says, how can we overcome postcode lotteries entrenching the poverty cycle and unequal opportunities in education? Now, we hear a lot about the importance of devolution and about local governments and local authorities and mayoral authorities making decisions about their own areas. as a way of getting better results than Whitehall knows best. But it does lead to this question of, as Greg says, postcode lotteries of different standards in different areas. I wonder if I can ask you, Ryan, how should government think about these pressures, the pressure to have a uniform service across the whole country, and also letting different authorities decide how to approach the challenges in their own areas? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real tension there. But to be honest, if you don't allow local innovation, some success, some not so successful stroke failure, then you never really see what works and makes progress. So it is unfortunate that you do get disparities, but if you don't try them out and try different things, you don't innovate. So that's my point on that. That's hard for politicians to do, but I think that's the main thing. I think on education, just on that, I think there's two things. One is obviously the quality of education that children from different backgrounds are receiving differs not only by income but by region. So poor kids in London, for example, seem to be getting a much better education than poor kids in coastal areas of England. So there's definitely a regional, not just income factor, which is playing a role here. And I think that one of the best, all the evidence seems to suggest that when you're in the school system, what makes the most difference is the quality of teaching. And I think why London has done particularly well, there's numerous factors. I think immigration, the London Challenge policy, but also, London is a magnet for highly motivated, highly educated graduates, particularly through the Teach First scheme. So is there a way of distributing highly talented, motivated teachers across the country, not just into London? And so, for example, social mobility supplements. Can you, just as if you have a supplement to come and live in London because of the higher cost of living, maybe there should be a supplement on your salary if you work in more deprived areas. So Justine Greening, when she was Education Secretary, created these opportunity areas. Maybe there should be higher supplements for teachers working those areas to really attract them to those places. And then the second point I'd make about education is actually a lot of educational attainment can be fostered right in the early years of a child's life. And so there's loads of studies about, at the age of 5, the cognitive ability of children can pretty much predict very strongly educational outcomes at the age of 26. That's not to be deterministic about it, like there's no hope beyond 5, but obviously the stronger foundations that you have in terms of concentration, communication skills right in the early years makes such a difference. And that's why I think when we think about childcare, we don't just think it as a service for working parents so they can go out to work, but as a high quality, vital part of our education system where we need high quality early years professionals. So I think the government really needs to think about how we can attract really motivated, talented people to work in the early years sector to really change and transform children's lives from deprived backgrounds. So building a high quality, world-class preschool system, I think, is essential.
It's interesting. Stephen, Ryan was talking there about sort of paying public sector workers more or teachers more in more disadvantaged areas. And when you put it like that, you can see how there's a sort of complementarity between getting this right and getting things like levelling up right. When it comes to these broad issues, do you think that this government thinks about welfare in the context of levelling up? What's your sense? I think you're muted again.
Sorry. So that's a really, really good question, Ben. What I don't think is happening is the kind of discussions that were going on 5 years ago or so when Baroness Stroud was advising the Department of Work and Pensions, where Number 10 really at that point decided to get a grip on the root causes of poverty. And you'll remember David Cameron's speech from, I think, the 2015 conference, the Assault on Poverty speech, where he talked about all of these root causes, the early years issue. And there was a moment there, and of course, that moment didn't last because of the Brexit referendum result came along and knocked that out the way. But there was an attempt right at the heart of government at that point to integrate all of these discussions, involve the DWP, the Treasury, Department for Education. And it does feel to me that we need to rediscover some of that. And it is absolutely at the heart of what levelling up should be about. But it does require Number 10 to be involved and to knock heads together across Whitehall and have that really, really difficult, intellectually difficult discussion about how certain causes interrelate. But that, to answer one of your earlier questions that were put to you about the root causes of poverty, that's the kind of business as Conservatives we should be in, as well as absolutely strengthening the social security safety net, which we talked about earlier.
Mm. Now, we've had a question from Charles Bradfield, and he asks, what should the government do to support families struggling with the psychological and economic costs of remote learning? I wonder if I can ask you this one, Alison, because the impression is that if you were a lower income family, you would have found much more difficult to do homeschooling in some ways. What are your thoughts about how, in terms of helping those families, what's the key element when it comes to the education side of things?
Well, I think, in the study that we did showed that a lot of parents also struggled financially because they needed to buy devices that they didn't have the money for, and because it took a long time for the computers that were on offer to get through to people. I think a lot of people have become quite sort of stressed by this whole process, and it also ties into their working lives, because if you're someone in low paid work, you don't get parental leave, for example. You certainly don't get paid parental leave. And that's meant people often losing jobs. And so it makes the financial struggle sort of butt up against the educational needs. And parents have found it really difficult. In our study, parents have found the home educating very hard, especially if they're trying to work at the same time. And some of us have had that experience ourselves. Very, very difficult indeed. I just wanted to add something that Ryan said earlier about childcare, because the big gaps in childcare in this country are for parents of disabled children, as Philippa was just talking about, but also older children and people working atypical hours. And what we also need, in addition to all the good things that Ryan said about early years, is we need extended schools. We have evidence from the Institute for Education that these enriching activities actually improve educational attainment for children and at the same time helps parents to work. So it's providing the same kind of opportunities as middle class kids already get that their parents pay for example. So there's a real sort of win-win that could be gained by going back to the extended schools agenda.
Philippa, David Bradfield also asked, could new grants for technology and additional tutoring services for these children who've lost out on education during lockdown have an impact? What are your thoughts about that? Should there be sort of tailored help for lower income children from lower income families as a result of the disproportionate damage they seem to have received during lockdown?
I absolutely think that tailored help would be helpful and effective. I think what you don't want to do, though, is just do that through the vehicle of technology. Technology is good for ensuring that the standard is high, but actually so many of these families actually need an adult around in order to ensure that that services the child really gets the benefit of it. And I think sometimes we can think, technology is the solution, whereas actually oftentimes in vulnerable households, a person might actually be a solution. And you've got to be living in quite a stable environment to be able to take advantage of a technological solution, which is why all these kids have kind of gone missing from the school system. So I would say, yes, as a vehicle of communication, but for a child to access it, it probably needs to be that plus.
Okay, well, so we're coming towards the end. It's been a great discussion. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give their sort of brief closing remarks, if you will. Let's start with you, Ryan.
Well, I think there is hope, actually, which is that we might develop a political consensus. And I'm seeing this on the centre-right, which is a kind of post-Thatcherite thinking, which is, for a long time, Conservatives have been associated with, opportunity, agency. Doesn't matter where you come from, as long as you get the opportunity, you can work hard and you can thrive. And this, there's lots of books by David Goodhart, Michael Sandel, other authors at the moment, which is critical of that. It's this sort of idea of a meritocracy where, you create this sort of educated elite, and then everyone else feels a bit sort of disenfranchised and depressed because they haven't got the educational qualifications and credentials that elite have got. And these authors have said, well, this is perhaps why people voted for Brexit and for Trump, to say, actually, this educated elite, we feel that they're looking down on us and it's not right. And so I think you're seeing a kind of shift from a more individualistic philosophy to a more communitarian one. And you notice that in the Chancellor's speech today, where he talked about the importance of community and belonging. And I think also a recognition, as COVID had shown us, which is that sometimes we're not completely in control of our fate. Sometimes things out of the blue hit us and we suffer misfortune and brute luck. So yes, we can improve educational opportunities, we can improve employment opportunities, but you know what? Poverty sometimes arises because of brute luck and no fault of our own. And therefore we need to build a social security system which reflects that. And I'm seeing a shift on centre-right thinking towards that, which I think is positive.
Excellent. Okay, over to you, Stephen. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. What I would just finish off by saying is if my party is serious about being a party of work, of good work, of looking after low-income families, if it's serious about holding on for the long term, all of those new low-income voters who gave us their votes at the last general election, then the kind of things that we've been talking about this afternoon, it will pick up and run with and really seize this as an important agenda. The message of that we've been relying on in recent years of how well the UK labour market has done and how many new jobs we've created, we can't rely on that any longer because, let's face it, COVID has undone so much of that good progress. We've got to forge a new message for this period. It's a period of crisis with the pandemic hanging over us, but I just feel there's an important moment here that for my government and party to seize.
Great. And Alison, your final thoughts, please.
Oh, sorry, couldn't get off mute. Yeah, really grateful to hear all that. That's really brilliant. And the lesson that these economic shocks can happen to everybody is really crucial. And that's what the social security system is for, always has been. So it's also crucial for the economy. And we know that child poverty is something that the public is really bothered about. I think it would be a real mistake to remove the crucial lifeline that's been thrown out of the additional £20. And it would be great also to see something targeted at children.
Great. And over to you, Philippa.
My last comment is really just to say, let's agree on how we're going to measure poverty. That we're 99% of the way there. The second that happens, we stop battling over it and we can actually start doing it and building a strategy that changes children's lives. And ultimately, that's what we're all here for.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Bright Blue and to the Child Poverty Action Group for organising this fringe event. Thank you to our panellists for speaking, Stephen Crabb, Alison Garnham, Philippa Stroud and Ryan Shorthouse. You can sign up to become a member of Bright Blue by visiting the Bright Blue website. Bright Blue has 15 fringe events they're hosting throughout the Conservative Party digital conference, which will take place in the designated Bright Blue space. Their next event is Having Healthy Homes, which is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m, featuring Lord Greenhalgh, Minister for Building Safety and Communities, Fiona Howie, the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association, and Nicholas Boys-Smith, the Chair of the Building Better, Beautiful Commission. So with that, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for a really stimulating and important discussion. Thank you for joining us.